The year is 712 CE. The city of Samarkand, the jewel of the Silk Road, is choked by the dust of an unstoppable army. Outside the ancient walls, the air is thick not only with dust but with fear, a specific profound fear felt throughout Transoxiana for the last decade. It is the fear of Quattaba ibn Muslim, the merciless Umayyad general and his cavalry. They have shattered the fragile alliances of the Sogdian princes, they have burned the Buddhist temples of Bukhara, and they have brought an entirely new kind of empire. But Quattaba is not facing a simple, localized resistance. Across the Jaxartes River in the vast, silent grasslands known as the steppe, the true powers of Central Asia are watching. These are the descendants of the Xiongnu, the Gurktuaks, the fierce, mobile warriors who have dictated the foreign policy of emperors in China and Persia for 1,000 years. They are the Turkic Kaganates, and they view the arrival of the Arabs not as a threat to a local city, but as an existential invasion of their world. For too long, we have viewed these masters of the steppe, the Scythians, the Huns, the Turks, the Mongols, as mere marauders, the barbarians at the gates. We see the destruction they wrought, the empires they toppled, the cities they leveled. We see only the storm. But this perspective misses the profound truth. The history of Eurasia is not a story of the settled world enduring the nomadic peril. It is the story of two worlds in constant, dynamic interaction. The nomadic people of Central Asia were not just destroyers, they were the engines of continental connectivity. They were the architects of a unique, mobile civilization and the vectors through which goods, technologies, and the great religions of the world, Buddhism, Manichaeism, and ultimately, Islam, were spread across the largest landmass on Earth. This is the history of the Central Asian nomads. From the moment they first learned to master the horse to the moment their military might fused irrevocably with the faith of Islam. It is a story of how the very structure of their environment shaped the most formidable fighting force the world had ever known. It is the story of kings who commanded not fixed borders, but vast, moving oceans of men and horses. The question we must answer is this: how did the nomadic, pastoral way of life, constantly on the brink of collapse from drought and winter, create states that were simultaneously the most fragile and the most powerful in world history? And what was the true, transformative price paid when the masters of the steppe finally encountered the zealous, uncompromising new power erupting from the sands of Arabia? From the earliest horsemen of the Pontic steppe, whose iron-tipped arrows brought down the power of Assyria, to the unified Turkic empires that stretched from the Black Sea to the Great Wall, this episode charts 1,000 years of political, cultural, and military innovation. We will follow the chilling ambition of Madan Xiongnu, the founder of the Xiongnu, who taught his troops total, unquestioning loyalty. We will witness the rise of the Turkic identity under leaders like Buman, whose legacy still defines modern Central Asia. And we will stand in the dust of Samarkand, as the world of the Silk Road, the world of the Sogdian merchant and the Buddhist monk, collapses under the pressure of the Umayyad Caliphate, forcing the proud Turkic warrior to make a choice that would redefine his people and, indeed, the entire Middle East. This is not a peripheral history. It is the history of the axle upon which the wheel of Eurasia turned. Pay close attention, for the lessons learned on the frozen, wind-swept steppe are the keys to understanding why modern empires rise, why they fragment, and why today's world borders look precisely the way they do. Our journey begins, appropriately, with the horse, for without this animal there is no story at all. By approximately 2000 BCE, the domestication of the horse had given the inhabitants of the Eurasian steppe a staggering advantage. It was not just a means of transport. It was a military platform, a food source, a political symbol, and the ultimate determinant of culture. Coupled with the development of the composite bow, a weapon made of wood, sinew, and horn that packed tremendous power into a small, rider-friendly package, the nomadic people had invented the ultimate military machine, the mounted archer. This invention was not just a tactical improvement, it was a societal revolution. It dictated that their economy must be pastoral, centered on livestock, sheep, goats, and most crucially, horses. Survival meant mobility, the endless, seasonal cycle of migration or transhumance to find adequate grazing. This nomadic pattern, forced by the vast, harsh, and resource-limited geography of the steppe, led to low population density but high military readiness. Every man was a warrior, every child was a rider. They were the masters of speed and maneuverability, a force that fixed, heavy infantry could not counter. The earliest historical echo we have of this power comes from the West. Around the 7th century BCE, the Scythians, an Iranian-speaking nomadic group, burst onto the stage of the Near East. They were famed for their horseback archery and their distinct animal-style art found in their elaborate burial mounds or kurgans. For a terrifying generation, the Scythians rode south, disrupting the fragile balance of the settled powers. They allied with the Assyrians, briefly ruled the Median kingdom, and became a factor in the collapse of the Assyrian Empire itself, even helping to sack the great city of Nineveh. This demonstrated, for the first time on a large scale, that the settled world was profoundly vulnerable to organized mobile power. But the real, enduring template for the nomadic superstate was forged further east, on the Mongolian plateau in the 3rd century BCE. This was the moment the Xiongnu unified. Their rise was a direct political response to the aggressive expansion of the newly unified Qin and Han dynasties in China. The Chinese sought to push the Xiongnu north of the Yellow River Bend, securing valuable agricultural land. The necessity of unified defense against the massive resources of Han China forced the fragmented Xiongnu tribes into a single, cohesive, and terrifying state. The man who orchestrated this transformation was Madan Xiongnu. He is the ultimate historical example of the charismatic, ruthless founder. The Chinese sources, which are our main window into this era, describe a horrifying ascent to power. Madan began by training his most loyal horsemen with a simple, yet profound lesson: absolute, unquestioning obedience. He invented a whistling arrow and commanded his men to shoot at whatever the arrow struck, even if it was his own favorite horse or his favorite wife, or, chillingly, his own father, the ruling Xiongnu. Those who hesitated were executed instantly. Once his followers could strike without question, Madan used this perfectly disciplined force to assassinate his father and seize power. The state Madan built was a reflection of this ruthless efficiency. Highly centralized under the Xiongnu, supreme ruler, utilizing a decimal system for military organization and absolutely focused on war and tribute extraction. Madan's Xiongnu shattered the Han armies, most famously at the Battle of Pingcheng in 200 BCE, where the Han Emperor Gaozu himself was humiliatingly besieged for 7 days. The Chinese response to this was not to conquer the steppe. They understood the futility of chasing mounted archers across the grasslands, but to manage the threat. They inaugurated the Hekin policy, or peace and kinship, effectively paying massive annual tribute in silk, grain, and gold, while sending imperial princesses to marry the Xiongnu. This strategy cemented the fundamental geopolitical dynamic for the next 2 millennia. The steppe extracted wealth from the settled world, either through direct raid or formalized diplomacy. The Xiongnu Empire, a testament to Madan's vision, defined the steppe for centuries, but like all early nomadic confederations, it suffered from one profound structural weakness: the lack of a clear, institutionalized system of succession. Upon the death of a powerful Xiongnu, internal feuds among the aristocracy invariably led to fragmentation. A strong leader created the state, a weak succession shattered it. When the Xiongnu eventually fragmented under Han pressure and internal strife, the torch of steppe power was taken up by successive groups: the Xianbei, the Rouran, and eventually, the people who would give their name to the largest linguistic group in the world outside of Indo-European, the Turks. This is the point where the narrative shifts from the generic steppe warrior to the specific Turkic identity. The rise of the Turks under the Ashina clan in the 6th century CE marked a profound new chapter, demonstrating the resilience of the nomadic model. They established the first Turkic Kaghanate in 552 CE, an empire of unprecedented size, stretching across the entirety of the steppe, from the borders of Byzantium to the fringes of China. This achievement, built on the ancient template of Madan, represented the true consolidation of the Turkic world. But even as the Turks rode triumphant across Eurasia, another world was stirring far to the southwest. A world that placed not the Xiongnu, but the Caliph at its head, and replaced the necessity of pasture with the absolute demand of a singular, uncompromising faith. The two great, mobile military forces of the ancient world, the Turkic cavalry and the Arab zealots, were on an inevitable collision course, and the collision point would be the glittering cities of the Silk Road. This sets the stage for the dramatic culmination of our story, where the power born of the wind and the horse would face the power driven by the word and the sword. To understand the drama that unfolded between the steppe and the settled world, we must first appreciate the rigid rules imposed by the Eurasian steppe itself. This environment was the ultimate structural determinant of nomadic life. Imagine a vast, undulating grassland stretching nearly 5,000 miles defined by extreme seasonality, scorching, short summers followed by brutal, long winters. This environment forced political and economic conformity. There was no vast agricultural surplus to support a fixed, sedentary bureaucracy or a large peasant class. The wealth was in movement, the health of the herds, the mastery of the horse, and the acquisition of external resources. The result was the pastoral military complex. The economy, the military, and the political structure were inseparable. The primary strategic asset of the steppe was not land, but mobility. A nomadic army could cover distances in days that would take settled armies weeks. They carried their logistics with them, relying on animal products, horse milk, meat, and captured stores. The ability of a single warrior to manage multiple horses, switching mounts frequently, provided an operational tempo the infantry-based forces of Persia, Rome, or China could not match. By the 6th century CE, when the Turks took center stage, the political arena of Central Asia was a complex tapestry woven from three primary threads. First, the sedentary empires, primarily the Byzantine Empire in the west, the Sasanian Persian Empire in the south, and the powerful, consolidating Tang dynasty in the east. These empires sought stability, agricultural production, and control of the lucrative trade routes. Second, the urban intermediaries. Chief among these were the Sogdians, based in the oasis cities of Transoxiana, Bukhara, and Samarkand. The Sogdians were the essential middlemen of the Silk Road. They were not great military powers, but they were master linguists, diplomats, and merchants. They facilitated the movement of goods, silk, jade, spices, ideas, Buddhism, Manichaeism, and people. Their cities were glittering centers of cosmopolitan culture and immense wealth, thriving by collaborating with whichever nomadic power controlled the immediate stretch of the road. Third, the nomadic power bloc now dominated by the Turks. The rise of the Göktürks, celestial Turks, in the mid-6th century under Buman Khagan was a monumental event. Buman, initially a vassal of the Ruran, used his military strength, mastery of ironworking, to overthrow his overlords and establish a new pan-steppe empire. This empire introduced the very word Turk to the world, proclaiming a new ethno-political identity. The Ashina clan, Buman's lineage, established a political structure based on the steppe ideal. Sovereignty was linked to a divine mandate Tengri, the sky god, and charismatic leadership. They created what historians call the Kagenate model. A supreme ruler, Kagan, governed a vast coalition of subordinate tribes and princes. This provided the necessary political flexibility for a huge territory, but it was structurally flawed. The inherent rule was the appanage system, where territory was often divided among the Kagan's relatives, often east-west divisions, setting the stage for inevitable internal strife upon the founder's death. The Kaganate had the mobility of a nomadic state, but also the instability of one. Despite this instability, the Kaganate period was crucial for cultural development. For the first time, we have a clear, written internal voice from the steppe. The Orkhon inscriptions, early 8th century CE, detail the history and political ideology of the Turks, emphasizing the importance of law order and the constant, existential struggle against the lure of sedentary civilization. They speak of the Kagan's duty to keep the Turkic people free and mobile, fearing sedentarization as a form of cultural death. But the Turks were already changing. Their interaction with the sophisticated Sogdian culture meant adopting elements of settled life. They used written scripts, eventually leading to the adoption of the Uyghur script for the Mongol language later, absorbed new religions, and profited immensely from the Silk Road. It is here we introduce Buman Khagan, not just as a conqueror, but as an empire builder facing the perennial nomadic dilemma. How do you rule a vast, settled territory without becoming soft, bureaucratic, and slow like the settled empires you conquered? He and his successors faced this challenge daily. They needed the Sogdians for taxes and administration, but they feared the Sogdian influence, the sedentary values, the luxury, the religions. Meanwhile, in the settled world to the south, the power dynamics were collapsing. The Sasanian Persian Empire, the ancient rival of Rome, was exhausted by centuries of warfare, and then everything changed. In the early 7th century, a new force erupted from the Arabian Peninsula, united by the radical monotheism of Islam. The armies of the burgeoning Caliphate, first the Rashidun, then the Umayyads, swept through the Near East with blinding speed. collapsing the Sasanian Empire entirely by the mid-7th century and pushing Byzantium back into Anatolia. Suddenly, the great powers of the steppe were no longer facing the familiar, predictable dynasties of Persia or fragmented China. They were facing a military power driven not by dynastic ambition or economic necessity alone, but by a world-altering religious fervor. This sets the stage for the ultimate clash of two mobile, militarily supreme, world-changing forces: the Turkish Kaganates, masters of the horse and the bow, and the Umayyad Caliphate, masters of the camel and the sword, led by the man whose ambition would forever change the geography of faith, Quattaba ibn Muslim. Quattaba was the quintessential Umayyad general, zealous, politically ambitious, and utterly effective. Appointed governor of Khorasan, the region encompassing modern Iran and Afghanistan, in 705 CE, his mission was singular: to push the boundaries of the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, across the river Oxus and into Transoxiana, the Sogdian heartland that lay between the Oxus and the Jaxartes. For Quattaba, the beautiful, opulent cities of Samarkand and Bukhara were not merely wealthy prizes. They were centers of polytheism, home to Zoroastrian fire temples, Buddhist monasteries, and Nestorian Christian churches, all centers of resistance to the caliph's rule. The Sogdian city-states, the traditional buffers between the nomads and the settled world, found themselves trapped. They had always paid tribute to the Turks for protection against the Chinese, or paid tribute to the Persians for protection against the Turks. They were politically flexible survivors, but Quattaba offered no flexibility. His advance was coercive, involving the mass conversion or subjugation of local populations. Cities like Bukhara fell, their religious institutions destroyed or converted into mosques. The settled world of the Silk Road was cracking under the weight of this new, uncompromising religious power, but the nomadic world was already preparing its answer. The Turkic tribes understood strength. They watched the Arabs dismantle the familiar landscape of Persia, and they recognized a threat far greater than Han China. The stage was set for the decade-long conflict that would determine whether Central Asia would remain a cultural crossroads or become an integral part of the Islamic world. This section ends with Quattaba standing triumphant over the ruins of a Sogdian temple, his eyes fixed on the horizon, knowing that the greatest struggle lies ahead: the vast, uncharted, and militarily formidable steppe, the home of the Turkic Kaganates. He is an instrument of destiny, driven by a faith that brooks no rivals, ready to face the masters of mobility. The collision between the Turkic Kaghanate and the expanding caliphate was not sudden. It was a slow, grinding war of attrition waged across the river boundaries of the Oxus and the Jaxartes for nearly a century, from the mid-7th to the mid-8th centuries CE. It was a contest not just of armies, but of opposing political philosophies and worldviews. The zenith of the Turks and the threat from the east. By the time Quattaba ibn Muslim began his advance into Transoxiana, the first Turkic Kaghanate had fragmented, a victim of its own success and the structural flaw of decentralized succession. Its successors, including the revitalized Second Turkic Kaghanate, were constantly engaged in managing internal dissent and external pressure, chiefly from the mighty Tang dynasty of China. The Tang, under emperors like Taizong and Gaozong, had exerted their own aggressive influence into the western regions, Xinjiang and parts of Transoxiana, attempting to absorb the oasis city-states that traditionally paid tribute to the Turks. This constant geopolitical juggling act characterized the life of a Khagan: fight the Tang in the east, manage the internal tribal aristocracy, and collect the tribute necessary to maintain prestige and cohesion. The Khagan's legitimacy was tied directly to his ability to distribute wealth, and that wealth largely came from the settled world, either China or the Silk Road cities. This pressure cooker environment required immense personal authority. Leaders like Kul Tijan and his brother, Bilge Khagan, whose lives are commemorated on the Orkhan inscriptions, were constantly striving to enforce the Tur law and prevent their people from being seduced by Chinese luxury. The inscriptions bitterly recount episodes where the Turks were nearly lost because their leaders became soft, adopting Chinese titles and customs. If the Turkic people had no ruler, they would not be free, the inscription warned. They became the slaves of the Chinese. This internal fear of assimilation was the great psychological weakness of the steppe empires. They needed the resources of the settled world, but they feared the corrosive effect of that world on their mobile, warrior culture. Culturally, this era was a furnace of ideas. The cities like Samarkand and Kucha were polyglot, polyreligious hubs. The Uyghurs, who would eventually overthrow the Second Turkic Kaghanate in 744 CE and establish their own empire, would famously adopt Manichaeism as a state religion in 762 CE, showcasing the incredible religious fluidity of the time, often mediated by Sogdian merchants. Before Islam, the steppe was a place of pragmatic religious experimentation, where faith was often chosen for political or trade advantage. But the arrival of the Arabs changed the calculus. This was not the Tang dynasty, which simply wanted taxes and control of trade routes. This was the Caliphate, which demanded political, economic, and spiritual allegiance. The Arab tsunami and Quattaba's choice. The campaigns of Quattaba ibn Muslim into Transoxiana, 705–715 CE, were a brutal exercise in military efficiency and religious conviction. Quattaba understood the fragility of the Sogdian city-states. He knew they would surrender if their economic lifeblood, their markets and irrigation systems, was threatened. His siege of Bukhara, one of the most important Zoroastrian and Buddhist centers, was strategically decisive. Quattaba faced initial resistance from local Sogdian princes, often supported by small detachments of Turkic cavalry from the Kaganate, but the forces were never unified. The Sogdians feared their Turkic allies almost as much as the Arabs, and the Turks themselves often fought for local advantage rather than a unified strategic goal. Quattaba's forces systematically dismantled the old order. In the cities he conquered, he imposed the jizya poll tax on non-Muslims. More critically, he destroyed the ancient centers of worship. Accounts describe Quattaba forcing the citizens of Bukhara to vacate half of the city's residential space to settle Arab families, and building the city's first great mosque on the site of a Zoroastrian fire temple. He aimed not just for conquest, but for transformation. He sought to make the conversion of Central Asia irreversible. The Sogdian world, which had flourished on fluidity and tolerance, was now faced with an uncompromising dualism: submission or resistance. A composite Sogdian character, let us call him Rustem, a wealthy merchant who traded in fine silks and understood a half-dozen languages, stands at the city gate of Samarkand in 712 CE. Rustem has survived every previous shift in power. He has paid tribute to the Turks, dealt silk to the Tang. Now he watches Quattaba's cavalry ride in. Rustem, representing the settled Iranian population, knew that resistance was futile. His choice, and the choice of his class, was pragmatic survival. Convert, or at least outwardly comply, and continue the flow of trade under the new iron rule. This compliance, driven by the desire to save their fortunes, became the critical foundation for the Islamic rule in Transoxiana. But Quattaba's ultimate military target was the vast, unconquered territory beyond the Jaxartes, the true realm of the Turks. Quattaba did not fear the Sogdians, he feared the mounted armies that could be mobilized by the Kagan. The climax: Talas and the permanent divide. The conflict reached its ultimate climax nearly 4 decades later, far to the east, in 751 CE. By this time, Quattaba was long dead, executed in 715 CE during an internal caliphate power struggle, a testament to the instability of the Umayyad state even at its apex. The Abbasid Caliphate had replaced the Umayyads, and their control over Transoxiana was solidified, though never truly secure. The Tang dynasty, meanwhile, was asserting massive military force westward. They had crushed the remnants of the Western Turkic Kaghanate and were attempting to absorb the entire region into the Chinese sphere of influence. The great Turkic tribes were fractured, often serving as mercenaries for either the Tang or the Arabs. The final collision came near the Talas River in modern Kyrgyzstan. The Abbasid forces, under Ziyad ibn Salih, faced a massive Tang army led by the Korean general Gao Xiongnu. This was arguably the most important battle in the history of Central Asia, for it forced the Turkic tribes to choose between the two sedentary behemoths. Crucially, the Karluks, a major Turkic group, initially allied with the Tang, defected in the middle of the battle, throwing their massive cavalry force behind the Abbasid lines. The defection of the Karluks was driven by their realization that the Abbasids, despite their religious fervor, were the lesser of two threats. The Tang dynasty had historically sought outright absorption and subjugation, turning the Turks into administrators or farmers. The Arabs, conversely, primarily wanted control of the trade routes and the conversion of the cities. They were more willing to incorporate Turkic military talent as mercenaries and slaves, rather than dismantle the nomadic structure entirely. The Abbasid victory at Talas was decisive. General Gao Xiongnu was routed, and the Tang influence in Central Asia was permanently shattered. The Chinese border retreated eastward, never again to threaten Transoxiana in this manner. The Battle of Talas achieved two profound things. The Arabs had won, but they had won because of Turkic cavalry. They could not hold Central Asia without the military power of the steppe. The Great Synthesis, the rise of the Mamluk and the Kara-Canad. Following Talas, the power dynamic shifted entirely. The Caliphate, now centered in Baghdad, needed vast numbers of reliable soldiers for its sprawling empire. They looked to the steppe. This gave rise to the Mamluk system. Mamluk, meaning owned or slave, were young Turkic boys purchased or captured from the steppe, brought into the Caliphate, converted to Islam, and given intensive military training. They were loyal, disciplined, and possessed the innate equestrian skill of their steppe heritage. This policy was born of necessity, but it was fraught with historical irony. The Turkic warriors, once the external pressure on the settled world, were now the internal foundation of the Caliphate's power structure. Their military effectiveness was so profound that, within a few generations, these slave soldiers became the effective power brokers, dominating the Caliphate's military and often deposing or installing caliphs themselves. The ultimate expression of the Turco-Islamic synthesis, however, came from the steppe itself with the rise of the Kara-Canads, c. 9th–13th centuries. The Kara-Canads were the first major, unified Turkic Kaghanate to voluntarily convert to Islam while maintaining a distinctly Turkic royal tradition, the Ashina-like lineage. Their conversion was a pragmatic political maneuver. By adopting the religion of the settled populace they wished to rule, they could instantly claim religious legitimacy and unify their nomadic warrior class with the urban Sogdian and Persian populations. They transitioned from being foreign conquerors to being the rightful protectors of the faith. The Kara-Canads fostered the first Turco-Islamic literary culture, marking a cultural turning point. Their courts patronized both Persian Islamic administrative traditions and Turkic identity, leading to literary works like the Quattadgu Bilig, Wisdom of Royal Glories. They ruled not just as Khagans of the steppe, but as sultans of the Islamic world, demonstrating the final, successful merger of the mobile military might of the Turks with the sophisticated administrative and religious framework of the settled world. This transition was not painless. The Kara-Canads' absorption into the Islamic political sphere meant that older Turkic religions, such as Tengrism, sky worship, Manichaeism, and Buddhism, began a rapid decline. The cultural crossroads of Central Asia was now fundamentally defined by a single dominant faith, but ruled by the warrior descendants of Madan Xiongnu and Bumin Kagan. By the 10th century, the great, purely nomadic empires were fading, not through defeat by external enemies, but through a long, strategic process of integration. The Turkic warrior was no longer merely raiding the settled world. He was ruling it, establishing a new political identity, the Turco-Islamic state, that would soon sweep across the entire Middle East, from Persia to the gates of Constantinople, preparing the stage for the Seljuks and much later the Ottomans. The narrative of the destructive barbarian was over. The age of the Turco-Islamic Sultan had begun. The period from the Xiongnu to the Kara-Canads did not just change borders. It changed the very nature of empire, warfare, and cultural identity across Eurasia. The legacy of the Central Asian nomads is not a series of scattered raids, but the foundation upon which much of the modern Middle East, Persia, and Central Asia is built. The linguistic and geographic transformation, Turkification. The most enduring and visible legacy is the Turkification of a massive swathe of Eurasia. The expansion of Turkic Kaganates, Gurktuks, Uyghurs, Oghuz, cemented Turkic languages as the dominant linguistic family across Central Asia, replacing earlier Iranian and Indo-European tongues. The Oghuz Turks, one of the later migrating groups from the steppe, are a perfect case study. Driven westward by internal steppe dynamics and the political gravitational pull of the Islamic world, they became integral to the next phase of history. After their conversion to Islam, their military expertise was leveraged for westward expansion. The Seljuks, a clan of the Oghuz, swept into the fragmented Middle East in the 11th century, capturing Baghdad and later shattering the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. This victory opened the floodgates for Turkic settlement into Anatolia, permanently turning the heartland of the Byzantine Empire into modern Turkey. The geographic footprint of this legacy is obvious today in the names of nations. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkey, the Turkic stands, all stand as direct linguistic and ethnic descendants of the Kaganates. The administrative and cultural synthesis. The Kara-Canads formalized the administrative synthesis, the fusion of nomadic military vitality with the Islamic world's highly sophisticated bureaucracy, jurisprudence, Sharia law, and religious scholarship. The cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, though initially shattered by the Arab conquest and later by the Mongol advance, which we will touch on shortly, quickly revived under Turkic Islamic patronage. The Kara-Canads sponsored public works, building monumental mausoleums and vast caravanserais, roadside inns that symbolized their dual role. They were mobile warriors who secured the roads, but they were also pious patrons who facilitated settled commerce and faith. The Kara-Canad success provided the foundational blueprint for all later Turko-Islamic empires, including the Seljuks, the Ottomans, and the Timurids. It demonstrated that true imperial power required the combination of steppe speed and caliphal legitimacy. The Sultan became the ideal Eurasian ruler, a mounted warrior king who was also the protector of the holy cities and the patron of Islamic learning. The Silk Road engine. The Nomads were the ultimate brokers of the Silk Road. Before their rise, the route was subject to constant fragmentation. The great nomadic empires, the Xiongnu, the Turks, the Mongols, provided periods of enforced stability or pax nomadic. They controlled the entire overland system, ensuring a high-volume exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. The Kara-Canads, by providing a unified, religiously legitimate rule over Transoxiana, brought a new period of economic security. This connectivity was so robust that it allowed the transfer of crucial technologies, such as paper-making techniques from China, acquired, according to tradition, following the Battle of Talas, accelerating the growth of Islamic scholarship and bureaucracy. The extensive discovery of Islamic coins far into northern Europe, Gotland, Sweden, often facilitated by nomadic intermediaries like the Khazars and Volga Bulgars, confirms the unparalleled depth of this Eurasian economic connectivity established under their watch. The counterfactual, what if Quattaba failed? To truly appreciate the magnitude of this legacy, we must consider the alternative. If Quattaba ibn Muslim had failed to secure the cities of Transoxiana, if the Sogdian princes, perhaps with unified Turkic support, had successfully pushed the Umayyads back across the Oxus River, the entire religious and political geography of Asia might have been radically different. Central Asia would likely have remained a religious and cultural kaleidoscope, continuing the syncretic tradition of Buddhism, Manichaeism, and Zoroastrianism, with political authority perpetually shifting between the Turkic Kaganates and the Chinese Tang dynasty. Without the conversion of the key Turkic groups, Oghuz, Karluks, Kara-Canads, there would have been no Turkic Islamic armies to sweep into Persia and Anatolia. There would have been no Seljuk Sultanate, no Ottoman Empire. The Byzantine Empire would have enjoyed centuries more stability in the West, and the history of the Crusades would have unfolded against a much weaker, fragmented Islamic Middle East. But history is relentless. Even without Quattaba, the demographic and military pressure of the Turkic tribes was unstoppable. The ultimate fate was probably not the persistence of pure nomadism, but a slower, less religiously focused sedentarization led by a Buddhist or Manichaean Turkic elite, still dependent on the resources of the settled world. The fact that the shift was accelerated and channeled by the uncompromising force of Islam made the resulting empires, like the Kara-Canads, stronger and more unified than their predecessors. The collision was inevitable. The outcome, Turko-Islam, was the greatest historical synthesis. The enduring pattern of fragmentation. Yet the history of the Nomads is also a lesson in fragility. Even the Turko-Islamic synthesis could not entirely overcome the ancient structural weakness of the steppe, fragmentation. The Kara-Canads themselves eventually divided into eastern and western branches. The political cohesion achieved by a single, charismatic founder always fractured, driven by the nomadic tradition of sharing sovereignty among sons and brothers. This dynamic became tragically clear in the 13th century, When the greatest nomadic storm of all, the Mongols under Genghis Khan, erupted from the steppe. The Mongol armies, which incorporated many Turkic groups and utilized the perfected steppe military doctrine, utterly devastated the settled Islamic states of Central Asia. Bukhara and Samarkand were leveled again in the 1220s. This devastation, graphically documented by observers like Ibn Battuta, showed the raw, destructive potential of the nomadic military when fully unified. But even the Mongol Empire, the largest the world had ever seen, could not escape the ancient curse. Within a few generations, it fractured into the Ilkhanate, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty, all struggling with the same core dilemma: how to govern a sedentary world without losing the military essence of the steppe. The long-term legacy, therefore, is one of creation born from destruction. The nomads shattered old orders, but in doing so, they provided the essential military and political framework for the powerful, culturally rich Turko-Islamic empires that would define the next 500 years of world history. The study of Central Asian nomads offers profound insights into the mechanics of history, challenging our settled, comfortable assumptions about how power is built and how civilizations endure. The power of mobility versus the burden of administration. The primary lesson of the steppe is the perennial tension between military strength and administrative sustainability. The Xiongnu and the Turks achieved rapid, massive power because of their mobility, the ability to appear unexpectedly, strike hard, and vanish, making them strategically invulnerable to slower, logistically heavy armies. But this very mobility was their structural flaw when it came to statehood. How do you collect taxes from a moving population? How do you maintain complex irrigation systems needed by settled farmers? How do you enforce a centralized law code across two continents without roads or fixed bureaucratic centers? The history shows that the moment a nomadic empire succeeded in conquering vast settled territories, it began the slow, inevitable process of sedentarization. It had to adopt the paperwork, the fixed currency, the urban administration, and the complex logistics of the people they conquered. This adoption, while necessary for long-term governance, inherently eroded the nomadic military spirit and discipline, leading to the decay predicted bitterly in the Orkhan inscriptions. The political structures, Kaganates, were strongest when the leader was charismatic and the tribes were fiercely mobile, and weakest when faced with the daily grind of administering a bureaucracy. Ecology as destiny. We often credit great men with the rise and fall of empires, but the story of the steppe demonstrates the decisive, brutal role of environmental determinism. The nomadic state was constantly balanced on an ecological razor's edge. A few years of mild climate allowed herds to multiply, populations to grow, and military resources to accumulate, paving the way for expansion. But a severe dzud, harsh winter, or prolonged drought could wipe out livestock, leading to famine, internal tribal conflict over shrinking resources, and the immediate necessity of external migration or raiding. Was the Huns' sudden westward surge in the 4th century CE driven solely by Attila's ambition, or was it a climate-induced chain reaction? Historical evidence suggests that climate change acted as the silent, structural push factor, forcing the hand of leaders like Madan and Buman. This reminds us that history is not just made in conference rooms and on battlefields, but in the long, slow turn of the planetary climate cycle. The political necessity of ideology. The Turkic conversion to Islam, epitomized by the Kara-Canads, provides a powerful political lesson. Military force alone cannot secure long-term multicultural rule. The early Kaganates were unified by the charisma of a leader and the threat of an external enemy, China. But Islam provided something more potent, a universal, transferable ideology that transcended tribal and geographic lines. The Seljuks and Kara-Canads became rulers of settled Islamic populations by presenting themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as the defenders of the faith. This religious legitimacy allowed them to tax, administer, and integrate local populations far more effectively than any previous nomadic regime, creating empires of unprecedented durability. A military machine is temporary, a shared ideology is permanent. Questions for reflection. The history of the Central Asian nomads compels us to ask difficult, enduring questions about power and survival. We must consider the moral dilemma of modern Xiongnu. is absolute, ruthless discipline, enforced by summary execution, the necessary precursor to building a state capable of preserving its people's existence against a massive external power like the Han dynasty. Think about the strategic choice made by the Karluk Turks at the Battle of Talas. When caught between two vast, uncompromising imperial powers, China and the Caliphate, how do small, militarily potent groups assess which power offers the best chance for long-term political autonomy or survival? Was the choice based on pragmatism or on a genuine inclination toward the new faith? Reflect on the nature of imperial vulnerability. How often in history have settled, technologically advanced societies been undermined not by overwhelming external force, but by the internal rot of corruption, political instability, and overextension, creating the perfect vacuum for a highly mobile, focused external challenger to exploit? Consider the Sogdian merchant, Rustem. If your way of life, based on tolerance, trade, and cultural fluidity, is confronted by a militant, monolithic ideology, is pragmatic compliance and preservation of trade the highest virtue, or is violent resistance, even if doomed, the necessary act of cultural defense? Finally, ponder the paradox of the Silk Road. Were the nomadic emperors, despite their violence and their demands for tribute, the ultimate preservers of Eurasian connectivity, ensuring the flow of goods and ideas for millennia, while the settled, bureaucratic states were ultimately too inward-looking and fragmented to secure the continental trade routes themselves? The steppe was a terrible place to live, but it was the essential axis around which the world spun. We began this journey over the frozen, limitless expanse of the Eurasian steppe, driven by the thunder of 1,000 horses and the whisper of the wind. We have seen how the ecological necessity of pastoralism forged the most disciplined and mobile fighting forces the world had ever known. We watched the rise of the Xiongnu under Madan, establishing the fundamental template of the nomadic superstate, a power so immense that it forced the Han Emperor to pay tribute, securing the steppe's authority for centuries. We traced the birth of the Turkic world under Bumin Kaghan, an empire that stretched across 2 continents, struggling with the perpetual tension between the freedom of the nomad and the burden of governing the settled world. And we stood at the final, transformative moment on the banks of the Jaxartes, as the furious expansion of the Islamic Caliphate collided with the established order of the Turks, resulting not in mutual annihilation, but in the profound Turco-Islamic synthesis. This fusion gave rise to the Kara-Canads, the first Turkic Kaganate to embrace Islam, blending the discipline of the horse archer with the legitimacy of the caliphate. It was a partnership that supplied the caliphate with its finest soldiers, the Mamluks, and eventually led to the Seljuks, who would become the effective temporal rulers of the Middle East, paving the path to Constantinople. The Central Asian nomads were not a footnote to history. They were the central actor, the indispensable link, and the relentless agent of change that connected East and West. They shattered old orders and provided the military foundation for the new, permanently shaping the linguistic, cultural, and political map of the continent. But our story does not end here. The Kara-Canads were only the beginning of the Turkic ascent within the Islamic world. The military machine of the steppe had been integrated, but it was not tamed. In our next exploration, we will look at the immediate successor to this tumultuous period. How did a small clan of Oghuz Turks, the Seljuks, move from being border guards to conquering Baghdad and shattering the Byzantine Empire? We will follow the dramatic westward surge that led to the Battle of Manzikert, a clash that decided the fate of Anatolia and made the Ottoman Empire possible centuries later. And then we must turn our gaze back to the eastern steppe, where one man, Temujin, was quietly perfecting the ancient techniques of Madan and Bumin, preparing for the final, cataclysmic storm that would be the Mongol conquest, an event that would level Samarkand, shake the foundations of Europe, and forever reshape the world trade system. The masters of the steppe are gone, but the spirit of mobility, the structural tensions of empire, and the profound legacy of their choices live on in every country they touched. The history of the world is, ultimately, the history of movement, and the greatest movements were always launched by the arrow released from the composite bow.